Hi, Michael here for Wasatch Fitness Academy and Asymptote Coaching. And today I want to give you a few ideas how I think about the idea of mobility and stretching and muscle flexibility and how all of these things come together. So let's get down a couple of language points first. And there's really no universal or agreed upon definitions of these words. But when I use these words, here's what I mean. So if we talk about flexibility, what I mean is how far can we take a joint through a range of motion at all? And so flexibility is how far does this thing move, right? It's range of motion. And the problem with focusing purely on flexibility is that we actually miss the concept of control. And so once we start talking about controlling a joint through its range of motion, right, we're starting to talk about tension. And tension is how much force can the bicep put into the elbow, for instance, at any given position. And if you've ever arm wrestled and someone said, hey, would you rather arm wrestle me with my elbow at 90 degrees or my elbow extended at 135? You probably know inherently that you'd really love their elbow to be out at 135 degrees because that muscle is a lot weaker. The forces on the elbow and on the whole structure of the arm are, the force they can impart on that arm is a lot less, right? So therefore, they're going to be functionally weaker. Their muscles haven't changed size, shape, really. All we've done is we've changed the position of the joint from a more advantageous position to a less advantageous one. So tension changes through the range of motion. Again, that real simple idea of arm wrestling somebody with a 90-degree bend or a 135-degree bend in the elbow. If that's true, then we should be concerning ourselves with the different degrees of tension at different spots in the range of motion. So if you have a limb, right, elbow is a really good example of this. Like if you can bring your elbow out straight and you are super, super weak at that very end range, but once it's bent a little bit, you're really, really strong. Well, that end range could be a problem because that end range is a place where the joint can go there, but you don't have the ability to create force. And that place where you can go, but you can't create any force is basically a place that you can't go to under any load. And that's a place where you can only get there passively. You can only get there when someone else is taking you there, where an external force is taking you there. The place that you can control it is our active range of motion. And so the problem that we often have is that we have very short active range of motion and really long passive range of motion. Well, what does this mean? How does this connect to stretching? Well, it depends on what kind of stretching we're doing. If your stretch is, I'm gonna have someone else like grab my leg and like push me, they're by definition pushing you into your passive range of motion. They're not asking you to create any muscular tension at all. And that can feel really, really relaxing. However, those results are typically not gonna last, right? We do that kind of stretching, we gotta do it regularly, we gotta do it all the time. So instead, what we should be thinking about is active range of motion and active stretching. The easiest way of thinking about doing this is actually stretching under load where you are exerting a ton of control. Here's a simple idea. When you are taking a muscle and a joint through their range of motion, the more neurological control, the more brain power you're putting into the muscles to control that range of motion, the better that goes, because then you're actually training your brain how to control your hip or your knee or your ankle or your elbow through a range of motion. There's a reason why we call it the neuromuscular system. It is because all of the brain power, all of the computing power for your muscles is in your brain. Your muscles do not have any muscle memory. Your muscles are like, they're really cool, but they don't have neuron cells to decide what to do, right? Like they don't have independent decision making. Now, if you were an octopus, then this would be a different story. Octopuses have decentralized, there's another word for that, but they basically have a decentralized nervous system. We have centralized nervous systems. Our brain is gonna make the decisions about the range of motion. So if you're missing range of motion on a joint, well, it's not just the muscle's problem, it is also a neurological problem. Your brain may not trust taking that joint to that end range. So how do we get the brain to be more comfortable taking a joint to end range? Well, we do exposure therapy. We expose it to a little bit of load, to a little bit more, and then we gently ease into it. So a really nice example of this, people who identify as having really, really tight hamstrings. If all we ever do for our tight hamstrings is stretch and like go into forward folds and get massages, the likelihood of that hamstring feeling looser is really pretty low, because all of those things are passive strategies. Someone else is doing the thing, or you're doing the thing without any muscular engagement. You want to make changes in how your hamstrings are functioning and feeling because they're feeling really tight, and you want to get them to feel less tight. The best way to do this is put some load onto them and then go into hip flexion or go into knee extension, moving against that load. So one of the videos that I have on the YouTube channel is for a Romanian deadlift. Romanian deadlift is basically a top-down, nearly stiff leg deadlift. We put a little bit of knee bend in the knees. We hang on to a couple kettlebells or a couple of dumbbells. We could do it with a barbell too, or a single kettlebell. And we hinge, which means we don't bend the knees very far. We add just a little bit of knee bend, but then the motion is primarily the hips going backwards as the hips hinge forward. So with the flat back, we go from really being here to being, lower angled. And how far down we go is a really good measure of how much room we have in the hamstring. And how much room we have in the hamstring is a really good measure of the neuromuscular connection between the brain and the hamstring and the control that the brain can exert. Because if the brain can't exert a lot of control on a muscle, it's actually one reason why it tightens up, because it's protective. It's protective to the muscle. And if it's protective to the muscle, then kind of by definition, it's also protective to the organism as well. You gotta remember, your brain is much more interested in your longevity and your ability to reproduce, because that's what survival of the species and of your DNA takes, compared to your desire to ski well or to like run a 50K. Your brain does not think at a biological level that those two things are very important, and actually probably would kind of rather have you not do those things. Strong skiing and 50Ks are definitely sexy, so they're really good for reproduction, but your brain doesn't quite get that logic, right? It hasn't figured that out yet. What your brain says instead is, hey, I view this as a threat to the system. And that's actually what stress does, and we get better, and so training for 50K is how you get better to get ready for 50K. And it's actually your brain adapting to that, but the brain would almost rather just the system be pretty lazy. Please don't do that, but just note that you have to actually engage the brain to engage the muscle, to change how the brain and the muscle are talking to each other. And that's really it, guys. So mobility is, at the end of the day, our ability to take a joint through a range of motion with control. Flexibility is how far can the joint go, but that's actually independent of control, and control is another word for tension. So the next time you go to a yoga class, for example, and you see you see the very prototypical women doing yoga who are in down facing dog, and they can push their head way through their arms, and their shoulder looks like it's like, I don't know, some like exorcist kind of thing, that like their arm is way back here and really close to their head, like their arms are straight overhead and they're coming way back. Know that those individuals have a tremendous amount of flexibility through their shoulder. But do they have much stability? Do they have much strength? If we were to give them a dumbbell or a kettlebell and say, here, hold this thing overhead and like go walk for a minute, do they come back like their shoulders collapsed, like it's bleeding, it's on the ground? Or have the shoulders at least fatigued? Or are they like still pretty strong overhead? And I'm gonna guess that the majority of them, if what they do is do yoga for the sake of flexibility, then they're gonna end up with that shoulder kind of like crumpling under the load. And it's not that they can't get to end range, they can get to end range and beyond it, but they can't actually control there, right? They're so used to resting into the end range of the shoulder socket that their ability to control the shoulder in one particular position is really weak. And that actually would mean that if that individual were to fall skiing and like fall on their shoulder, their likelihood of shoulder injury goes way up because they don't have any muscular control to protect them against the forces that they would hit the ground with. All right, guys, that's it. A bit on stretching, a bit on language. And then also, thinking for yourself, when you are trying to improve your range of motion, do you primarily do that from an active position, or do you primarily do that from a passive position? And if most of what you do is passive, Look for some ways that you can be more engaged, more active in that, provide some resistance, do some more work, and see if that doesn't help. And definitely check out that RDL, the Romanian deadlift video, if you feel like your hamstrings are tight, and give it a go. Start really light. You don't have to go very heavy. 10 or 20 pounds might work just fine, but see if you can get your brain and your hamstrings into a feedback loop, and then if that doesn't make some change for you. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.